Today I'm in conversation with Farida Hughes. Farida is an abstract visual artist working in mixed media with oil paint and resin. Originally from New York and New Jersey, she has lived in 6 US states and currently resides outside of Baltimore, Maryland. Hughes has an undergraduate degree in studio art and English from Fordham University in New York and an MFA in visual art from the University of Chicago. For many years, she balanced work as a graphic designer with her studio practice and is now happy to be painting full-time from her Baltimore studio. Welcome, Farida. Thank you for joining me today to talk about your creativity.
Thank you for inviting me, Jeffrey. It's great to talk to you.
It is good to talk to you as well. So what I'd like to do is have you maybe explain about the medium you work with and a little bit about your process. So several of our viewers in the Midwest might not be familiar with your work since you are working on the East Coast now. And so give us a little introduction into who you are as an artist.
Okay, well, that could take a while. It depends how far back you want to go. I've always been an oil painter, and I consider myself an oil painter, even though over the years I have moved to using what I'm currently painting with as a 2-part epoxy resin. But I mix oil paint into it. So the resin is fluid, the color comes from the oil paint. And you could think about it if you're a painter and understand acrylics, you thin out with water. Watercolor, you thin out with water. Oil paints, you thin out with oil or solvents or both. Solvents such as turpentine or mineral spirits. Instead of the oil or the solvents, I'm using the resin. So the resin thins the paint, it's clear. I add the color to it by mixing the paint with, which is a paste, as it comes out of the tube into the resin, and then I end up with a colored liquid, which I can manipulate the opacity of. So if I want a very translucent layer, I put less paint in. If I want a very solid layer, I'll add more paint to a degree. I can't add too much paint because then I interrupt the properties of the resin and it won't set well. So there's a lot of chemistry. But I consider myself an abstract, organic abstract painter. I'm not a hard-edged painter. Definitely abstract, and my shapes come from memory. They come from my own response to what I'm thinking and feeling, my own response to color, and how that moves together on my, wood. Now I'm painting on wood rather than canvas. So,
okay, how did you discover the use of resin and oil paint? That seems like an interesting combination.
Right. That's why I said it could be a long story. I at some point, I was going back to watercolor to play around with some small sketches and found that I loved the way I could move the pigment into the water and let it flow. And after time, I found that I could not recreate that with my oil paints. And I also wanted to have a solvent-free studio, thinking about health concerns and problems with vapors in the air and what we're breathing. And so I tried to get rid of turpentine, tried to get rid of mineral spirits, but nothing on the market gave me the process of moving the paint that I enjoyed. So things dried too fast or they're too shiny. And there are a lot of things out there. If you go to the art store, you could stand in the paint aisle and just be dumbfounded. But so I developed my own painting medium that was mostly it still had I would guess a little solvent, but its main ingredient was oil of spike lavender. I was painting with that for a while, which gave me a fluidity, a softness to my paint application. But I still wasn't close enough to watercolor. And it was a really trial by error. I kind of just fell into the resin, picked some up, brought it home, and started playing with actually three-dimensional things at first, and then started putting my paint into the resin and building these objects, and eventually started painting with it on tiny, small paintings, and then larger, and then larger, and then it became the thing that I use. So, and I can show you, because behind me I have some paintings here, and the surface is very glossy.
Oh,
So you can see the light catches on them. The one right behind me is the windows on it right now, so you can see how shiny it is. That wasn't necessarily what drew me to it, but I enjoy that. But what I really love about the resin that I use and the way that I've developed working with it is how I can develop new colors by layering one color over another. And that process that happens as I work through a painting layer by layer, and the translucency of the medium allows for so many variations to happen, and so many exciting passages that to me is just wonderful.
yes.
Yeah.
It kind of is that combination of watercolor where you can have that transparency in layers. I think that's a wonderful combination that you've come up with to work with. As an abstract painter, how do you come up with your ideas for painting or your concepts?
My work has been really about movement and group relationships and community for many, many years. I would say I started out painting butterflies and group movements of butterflies, and then birds, and then trash blowing in the wind. And over time, it became really about people and community and relationships. And so that's where I start my paintings, is thinking about a story of a person, or story of a group, or something that happens in the news that I may internalize for a period of time, and then that becomes maybe the start of a new series, or the story of a painting. But it really, the forms that I create, the relationships that I'm working with, really come from thinking about people, thinking about how we relate to one another, how we build community, what our overlapping histories are, and how we create balance out of that.
So what do you think a creative person or an artist in a community, what's your role? What does an artist do for a community?
It's a great question. I think artists are observers, being in the community, being a part of a community. You observe things, or I do anyway, and then I can retell them. So artists are I think, really important in showing each other who we are at the moment in time, who we are, what we're saying, what we're thinking about, how we're solving problems, how we're getting along, moving ahead. And people, artists do it in different ways, musicians do it in different ways, dancers, but it's communication.
With your paintings, talking about community and your discussion of the artist role in the community, do you ever bring in members of the community to work with you on a painting or around an idea?
I haven't. That's an interesting thing to consider for the future. Of course, right now it's hard to go and interact with people, but Zoom is a great way to do that. Um, I haven't actually done that in person, but what I do is I collect stories from people. So I have one project I've been working on for a number of years that I call Blends, Blends, and the idea is that each one of us as a person, as an individual, is a blend of the histories of the family that came before us, that we're a part of. So I have asked people to share with me their story of their cultural and ethnic background, or their children's. If you have a family and you two individuals or blended together create another blended individual. And I think those stories are fascinating. And when they come back to me, it's often not just a checklist of where my family's from, but it's a story, really sometimes personal, sometimes astounding little snippets of histories. And as I do, I have over 30 paintings of these done, and they're very abstract. They're, you can just say they're layered colors, but the colors and the shapes that I create are in response to the stories that I'm working with. And so if I consider each painting then a portrait, even though there's no face in it.
Right. Portraits don't necessarily have to be a literal representation. I love that project. I think it's really great to be able to collect people's stories and find ways to represent them. I know with the pandemic, that does change things. We interact with each other in many different ways now. Has the pandemic affected your work at all?
For a while, I did move out of my studio, and I brought a lot of materials back to my house and created a space in the dining room, covered everything with plastic because the resin, once you drop it, it is permanent. It can't be removed unless it's on plastic. Then I can. But working at home changed a few things. I started working smaller, but I also had started right before we went into a shutdown period. I'd started some very large panels. So I brought those home as well. And so I have two extremes. But my light was different in the dining room. It's very different than painting in my studio, which is a lot of light in here. And so I think that affected my color, and I paid attention to my color in a different way, which I think in a way was liberating. I started painting a little bit differently and flowing color toward the edges, whereas before I was really keeping things within the sort of central area of the format that I was using. And I can show you a little later if we walk around what I mean about that.
Sure.
And then I began thinking about this moment in time and what it means, and what as artists we are saying then to each other about who we are and what our purpose is, and in the space that we're in, how we communicate differently. So I think there have been changes, and over time I may be able to articulate some of those differently. But I also started a series that was really directly influenced by some of the happenings of the past year, and that I'm still developing, so I don't have a lot to show yet.
You mentioned how light has affected your work through the pandemic from shifting into space. Was that something you were conscious of and used beforehand, or was this a new discovery?
I think it was a new discovery. I had maybe you take for granted the light that you have in your space, and the ways that you're working. And when you make a change, by necessity, it's affecting you. So, um, actually, I ended up painting one piece on the floor of my dining room and had grand ideas for it. And it really didn't happen. It didn't work out. And partly because of the light that I had in the space and on the floor. I was really painting in darkness, and the colors weren't working together like I was expecting them to. But I wasn't seeing them the same way as I do when they're up on the table with the window behind them. So it does make a change. But I also realized being more in the domestic space made me see the light in my world a little differently. Interior light as opposed to going outside and seeing light in the trees and the landscape, and noticing the small changes in nature every day because you're there, witnessing it. And that was really exciting. You know, it's in a way, it's like eye-opening to um, that's a kind of a pun, isn't it? Eye-opening to understand what you're seeing. But that, yeah, it's amazing to actually witness how light changes what you see over time. If you even think about it in a still life, and how the sun moves across a shape over hours in a day, what that does to that shape.
I think that's a really excellent point. How, as a creative or an artist, it's about observing. It's not always about um, the actual act of making something. There's more to it than using the materials to create something, but it's also that observation. And I think it's really great that you shared with us learning about the light. And sometimes I think we forget that the environment in which we work has an impact on what we're doing. And that's a really great point to share with people that maybe aren't practicing creatively. Is it's not always about materials and it's not always about the outcome, but there's things that you discover along the way, such as the quality of light or the temperature of it or how it moves through a space. And all of those things can contribute to a work. I think that's a really great point. I'll be curious to see how your work changes over time because of that.
So will I. And it's interesting too. I don't want to force it now that I've, made that a statement, or that our observation, and I'm telling you about it. I don't want to force that to come into the painting. It should be a natural thing, in that you look back and say, oh, I know what it was that influenced this slight change, or that, created this work, or that moved me ahead in this way.
You talked about how you discovered the one particular painting didn't work, or maybe we could talk a little bit about failure in a practice and how you might use that as you work.
Yes, and I find myself telling people that every piece, every work that I do fails in the middle. I think that one has to accept that failure is inevitable, and you have to work through it. Because if you're afraid of failing, you're never going to get anywhere. But one beautiful thing I think about creating and making something, whether it's soup or a delicious, cake, or a painting or a quilt, is sort of that struggle of starting and then working through it, and the diligence of finding things along the way, accepting those things, and then coming out on the other end having solved the problem. And that's, I think, all of my work is this. I set up a problem and I try to solve it. And sometimes it takes months. Not very often is it immediate, but
Do you have
but that's
works? Do you have works that you just never seem to resolve, and they're just set aside?
yes. Yes. And one nice thing about this pandemic time is that I was able to pull some of those things out and also just bring them home, um, and figure out what to do with them, because there's always stuff around an artist studio that's a beginning of an idea and then left as you've moved on to the next thing. And I had a lot of those things around, um, and there are still some things at my house that I didn't finish, but um, but yes, I mean, I'm looking at something right now, which may never be a painting. It may always just be an experiment, and that's okay. It's teaching me something.
Do you experiment a lot with your practice now?
I'm experimenting with some materials now. I found a lot of trash in the woods when I was home, for that time period, and I started picking up mesh that I found in the woods, and it's just things that kind of gets blown around in the wind. Using that in some works that I'm developing with the resin, and they're more of they're 3-dimensional in form, but I still consider them paintings. I am working on learning how to cut aluminum and to create some different kinds of supports for my work. I do experiment because I work in series. And so I'm usually working on 5 paintings or so at a time. And I do experiment that way because I can do, work on the blends project. And that's one way of thinking, and it comes from a narrative, comes from a story. But then another series might be completely off the wall and just reacting to, my mood or the weather, and then maybe I'll put a story to it later. That's what I have going on right now. Is that I'm playing with my medium in a different way than I had been working with it before, and seeing what it's going to be.
When you work in a series and you're doing kind of multiple projects, will one inform the other? Do you find crossover between one, like your blends project, and some of your other work?
I think because all the work comes from the same idea of community and relationships and interacting with people, that there is a link between the series. So one of my series that I haven't worked on in a while, but that's this painting behind me. I'll show you that one. That one actually has thread in it. And the series is called Common Threads. And the thought is that we're all linked somehow, or when you meet someone and you start sharing stories, you find out you have these small little common things. And I started using the thread remnants from the serger sewing machine, the interlock sewing machine, because it created this little chain of thread. And so that those chains are actually what I embed them into the paintings for this series. So that it's still talking about community relationships and links, and the blend series does it in a very different way.
I'm curious to, I've never really worked with resins. And when you add material like the thread into a painting, do you have very much time to work with it? Do you have to make things happen within 5-10 minutes, or like with typical oil paint, you have a series of hours before things start to change.
Right. That's a great question. The resin that I use, I have about 45 minutes working time with it before it starts to set. And then that process happens um, either slowly, where it might start getting more gummy, it won't flow as easily. Or if it's too hot in the room and the resin gets too hot, it might happen immediately once it hits that point. There's nothing you can do at that point, just throw it away. Um, so temperature in the space does affect the medium. But once so I have a certain open time with it, and I know that, so I'll only mix up enough that I know I'll be able to work with in the time that I have, and in the size that I'm working. So those things I have to figure out before I start mixing my materials, and I can add things to it. Sometimes I'll glue things to it, or sometimes I'll catch it when it's at a jelly consistency in between 3 and 7 hours, and then embed things into it if I want to. But it takes 24 hours to set to a hardened point where it's not going to be gummy, and then about 3 days to get a full cure. So knowing the working times of the material, I'm able to understand how to layer it as well. And I work in layers. So a painting takes a long time because a layer may be just one color. And then I come back the next day and do the next color.
The material you're working with and the way you're working is something that I haven't really seen too much. So where does your influence come from? What artist influence your process and your colors? Who inspires you?
It used to be the abstract expressionist artists. I looked at them a lot. And Joan Mitchell was a favorite of mine when I was young. Before them, I liked Paul Cezanne. I liked the Cubist artists. I liked looking at Impressionism. And I liked John Singer Sargent. and mainly because of the way he used paint, the way he manipulated paint on the canvas. And one thing I loved, an art teacher in high school told me about painting was to just suggest on your canvas. Don't overdo it, just make a mark, just suggest, which I thought was a beautiful way of articulating the artist's hand to the finished product through the movement and gesture of the brush. And I think Sargent does that phenomenally well. And one thing I also love about some of his work and some of Joan Mitchell's work is the way they use white. And the white is often so thick on the canvas, but it's to show light, which is just an odd way of thinking about it. But it's so sculptural, so thick, but it's showing the lightest areas of the painting. It's quite amazing. So I think about how things connect on the surface, and try to find balance that way in connecting shapes and colors. And I think I'm drawn to artists who are doing that. I also like a lot of sculptors. And I think, again, it's form and space, and the way negative space and positive space and form and light create surfaces.
Well, thank you for sharing your inspiration. We definitely can see that in the works that you have.
I'm walking toward the table that I mainly work on. So right here, you can see 3 paintings that I'm working on today. And this is what I was saying, I'm experimenting with a different way of using the resin. So these small little dots, maybe they look like Seurat paintings, but they're again abstract, and they're thinking about light and color to create a form. Now, this is the table I work on. This is my palette. Open it for you. So these are my colors. And I mix the resin and then mix the color into it. And then in my space, I have an old TV cabinet that I made with my husband that now holds art supplies and storage, and then lots of art around. So I was talking about experimenting with things I picked up in the woods. So some mesh refuse has gone into these hanging pieces that I'm working on, and the rest of the space, I have a table here, and then I built this big wall. I'm going to back up so you can see it better. That is on rollers, and I can move it around. So I can be an exhibition wall, but also it holds all these old large paintings of mine that I'm not showing anymore. And then that's where I was sitting. I also, when I moved into this space, I had this little closet area built. So in there I have my kitchen. And a sink. Artists have need for a sink, a little microwave, and then a little area where I keep tools and junk. So it's a large space. It's a little bit larger than I was looking for, but it's what I found, and I'm really glad to be here. Here are a couple of the blend paintings that we were talking about, that series. There's one, there's another one. Each one of these has a story, and when I exhibit them, I exhibit the stories as well. Here are a couple more that I just finished. And here's the painting that I said I started on my floor in my dining room. Wasn't working. And it's become something very, very different. And I'm happy with it now. But it's really very different from what it started out as. And then we talked about how I was painting with forms in the middle of the canvas, like this. And then during the pandemic, I ended up, here's one, moving the color to the edges for different reasons. And so that was a big change. And it's very sunny in here. I don't know if you can even see that. But, and the color goes all the way to the edge, and was really a big change for me.